Mark Rogers TV talking national championship game with Elizabeth Grant of 3 Yards in the Cloud. Elizabeth, it's been a while. How you been?
I'm great, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. So I just thought I need to talk to Elizabeth before we kick off on Monday night, get her feel for the game. And definitely, if people haven't heard you in the past, just deliver a sermon on the integrity and the value of the ground game in college football, the foundation of college football. Uh, Definitely, based on that, I should have a thought or two toward which way you would be leaning in this game, possibly.
Yeah, obviously my site, 3 Yards in the Cloud, is, from the great Woody Hayes. I love a good ground game. I've always talked about how much I love the running game. And Alabama is my alma mater, so I'm naturally a fan. But I am pretty good at finding stats, for any teams that I'm talking about. And but I am always nervous about an Alabama game personally. But I have to say, I feel confident in that Alabama has what it takes. They have the players. I think they have the personnel. I think they still will outscore Clemson on Monday night for several different reasons. And I knew after the first round of the playoffs when Clemson completely dominated Ohio State and Alabama struggled a little bit against Washington, I knew that Alabama was going to get buried in the media and no one was going to remember the entire season. And that sort of, it's funny when I pick my games on my show every week, Joe Public is always looking at what happened just in the week prior, and they sort of forget everything that happened before. And that's sort of what's happened again for the playoffs. But when you're looking at a national championship game, I think you really do have to look back at the entire season as a whole and see where weaknesses are and where their strengths are and what they did against certain teams, and that will give you more of an indicator on how the game will play out on Monday.
Elizabeth, I just don't know what it is with these Alabama running backs, because let's take some of the top 5 to 10 teams in the country. So we saw Mike Weber with Ohio State on Saturday night, Wayne Gallman with Clemson, Myles Gaskin, 1,000-yard back with Washington. Capable guys, I'm sure we'll see at the next level. These last 2 Alabama running backs, meaning Derrick Henry and now Bo Scarborough, they just look like monsters. They're not necessarily better, and Derrick Henry's showing that in the NFL. He's a good back. He'll be fairly productive, but not a great back in the NFL. But they just look like monsters that nobody wants to get in the way of. Nobody wants to have any business tackling these guys, and that's what Clemson's going to have to deal with on Monday night.
Yeah, I don't know what they're feeding these guys in Alabama for them to be so big. And it's funny, we joke so much about when we're watching Bo Scarborough and how much he looks like Derrick Henry. I mean, just physically, they are huge. And yeah, Bo Scarborough has been a breath of fresh air all season and has been able to take some of the pressure off of Jalen Hurts, with Jalen Hurts being, such a young quarterback, being that true freshman quarterback. And there's been a learning curve this year. Clearly, we've seen it. And but I do think that the distractions from Lane Kiffin and things that I've heard in the last few games of the season leading up to his departure this past week has been a major distraction for the Alabama offense and especially Jalen Hurts. And I've heard now with Lane Kiffin gone, that a lot of that is gone, and the attitude, the positivity has all sort of returned back. And I heard that it has helped him with his confidence level that has been a little shaken the past couple of games.
So for a second there, I was reading into the transition being kind of a negative and a difficulty, a challenge for the offense to get used to a different voice in Steve Sarkisian versus Lane Kiffin. But you're now spinning it into a positive, getting rid of some dead weight of sorts, and Lane Kiffin moving on to FAU and Steve Sarkisian, and knowing that the process is in place and we're all together, we're all on board, and we're going to be here and play this through the national championship game without any undivided attention being an issue. So Jalen Hurts, I would think, would be, despite being a dynamic player, offensive player of the year in the SEC, a bit of a concern maybe for you. Anything else besides Hurts in the Alabama camp that should be concerning?
No, I mean our secondary was a little bit of a concern when Eddie Jackson went down, but Minka Fitzpatrick has really stepped in and filled that void. And the defense is still they're a scoring defense, and I don't really see any other deficiency in this defense. I think this is this is definitely Nick Saban's best defense in my opinion. I think could definitely rank in one of the best defenses of all time. I think they've improved from last year, especially they gave up 40 points to Clemson last year. In that game last year, neither team could stop the other. And it really took that onside kick, which I thought was a brilliant call from Nick Saban, very uncharacteristic, but again, just sort of proves how he's the better coach of the two between he and Dabo Swinney. And when he called for that onside kick and they got it and Alabama eventually scored a touchdown, it just gave them that momentum that they needed moving forward. I do think, last year, Alabama had 14 points from O.J. Howard. Really, Clemson blew some coverages against O.J. Howard, and, he had like 250 yards in that game. Well, that's not going to happen again. I went back and I looked at, it's no secret that Clemson has struggled many times this year. Let alone their loss to Pittsburgh. You go back and you look at their game against Auburn, that was close. Their game against Troy, that was close. The really lucky game against NC State. And I went back and looked, and I saw that in all of those games that were close, including the loss to Pittsburgh, Deshaun Watson was not able to run. In that game that they lost to Pittsburgh, Deshaun Watson was held to 8 yards rushing. In the game against Auburn, he was held to like 21 yards rushing. And so I think that is going to be the key. He has struggled to really make some plays with his legs. Now granted, he's passing for 200 and 300 yards a game. But when Deshaun Watson is contained and he's not able to scramble, that's how you beat Clemson. And I think Clemson's defense, on the flip side, they've struggled against dual threat quarterbacks, which I think will give Jalen Hurts that little bit of an edge in this game with Clemson having a weaker defense. I think Jalen Hurts could have a really big game against Clemson.
Yeah, it's almost like a shock value that we see in different units from these teams when they get to the biggest of bowl games or in the playoffs, where that's the best offense that you're going to see this season. That's the best defense. That's the fastest wide receiver or running back. Fill in the blank. And for Alabama, they haven't seen an offense this good. And for me, I think we have to take it all the way back to week 3 or 4 against Ole Miss when Chad Kelly was hitting on all cylinders. The Rebels were playing well. They were healthy right out of the gate and gave Alabama fits for most of that game, 48-43. And since then, the Alabama defense basically hasn't been challenged. Now, Clemson provides, if they're on their game, and with Mike Williams being in play this year as opposed to missing the national championship game in the entire season last year, that gives Clemson a bit of a different dimension in that one guy that can blow the top off a defense. And then, of course, for Clemson, it's, yes, we've seen some good defenses, and the best defense I think they've seen this year would be either Florida State or most likely Ohio State, one of the top 5 defenses in the country. But now they see what's definitely the best defense in the country that's been completely immovable, especially in the running game. And there's that shock value of the first few minutes of the game, seeing the best of the best and being able to adjust to that. So all that said, Elizabeth, do you have a feel for this game? Or are you going to give us a pick? And I understand if you don't, because obviously you want to maybe save that for your segment. So do you have a pick, or where can we find you to get that final prediction?
Oh yeah, I've got a pick, and I've already talked about it. I put it out there. And I will say my record for Alabama the past 2 years is I've been right every single time. I picked them nearly every week. The only time I was wrong about Alabama was last year when they played the Vols. Alabama did not cover in that game. They didn't cover the 14 points. That's the only time I was wrong.
So you're talking about being right against the spread. So that's a whole different deal. Wow.
That's a whole other ballgame to be right against the spread. Right, exactly. But I do believe Alabama has the edge in this game. I do believe Alabama has the better coach of the two. I know Alabama has the better defense of the two. I think Alabama has the better running game of the two. You know, the X factor for Clemson is going to be if Deshaun Watson can throw for another 400 plus yards like he did last year. And, you know, that will make that game close again. But in games like that, especially when I know that Nick Saban is facing a coach twice in less than a year, I will go with Nick Saban all day long. Love him or hate him. You know, he's just somebody I'm never, ever going to go against in that situation, especially. And I don't think we're going to see as much scoring as we did last year because I do think Alabama has improved. But I do believe Alabama wins 31-24.
All right, there you heard it from Elizabeth Grant, 3 yards in the cloud. Elizabeth knows her stuff. So one loss against the spread, that's key because that is very difficult to do because I pick the games each and every week, both straight in against the spread. And I'm not going to try to compare records with you, Elizabeth.
You know,
That is exceptional.
When someone always asks me about that, I normally always pick it based on running games. You know, I look at who can run, who can stop the run, and that's normal. And if I can't find a game that matches up with that, I just won't pick it. But in this national championship game, there are so many different factors, you know, that leading into this game. Look, I think Deshaun Watson should have won the Heisman Trophy. I've been saying I think he's the best quarterback in college football from day one. And, you know, the fact that Auburn was able to hold Deshaun Watson to what they did, and that game was so close and nobody thought Auburn could hang with Clemson. And you go back and you got to look at games like that all throughout the season. I really believe Alabama has the edge in that, and they will be able to contain him more than they were able to last year.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for stopping by. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. You guys take care.